like the monocarboxylates, the tricarboxylates, there are reabsorptive mechanisms to recapture those. So you have two processes. You have processes of reabsorbing the good stuff, like the lactate, the dicarboxylic acids, the tricarboxylic acids. But at the same time, you have a mechanism for also secreting organics that aren't reabsorbed. Okay? See if I have anything to add to that. Probably. No, that's probably good. Okay. Now let me get to where I wanted to get to before. Any questions on that? Okay. So remember I'd said that we've done everything but reabsorb chloride. So let's look and see what happens towards the end of the proximal tubule. Always first, right? He's getting it. He's getting it. He's getting it. Yes!
Thank you.
Did anybody else see that? Well, you're too slow, though. Okay. So that's just my little trick to see if I can keep you sharp, okay? And it sort of worked, didn't it? All right. So in this part of the tubule, you have and I'm going to put in what Costanzo uses. I think it's Formate. So, at one time I tried to cancel out some of these things and it didn't work very well, but I think it's worth doing it this way. So, this is the same sodium-hydrogen exchange we were talking about before, but we also have a means of exchanging chloride with formate, and maybe a whole bunch of other things. Formate, there's not a lot of it around, but formate, succinate, oxalate, maybe bicarbonate, whole bunch of things that can exchange for the chloride. So the net effect here is that when you combine these two systems, you're reabsorbing sodium chloride. Okay? H plus and formate make H formate. An unionized formate can go back in here. Okay? Make sense? Yes, ma'am.
Can you say that's like a passive process?
Oh, passive process. Okay. So this is passive because, I mean, we're shifting it out, making lots of this, and because we've taken the hydrogen formate out here and pumped it out here, the gradient's relatively low here. So yes, this would be a passive process. Yes, good. Thank you for that question. Okay, so in addition, that kind of helps us with chloride. In addition, how much have you done on tight junctions? A little, okay. We can also move substances by paracellular mechanisms. And there are claudins that, come across claudins before? Okay. And this is probably claudin 10. However, somebody asked me the question the other day. You don't need to know all the numbers, but I'll just tell you what they are. Claudin 10 actually moves chloride through the paracellular route. Okay? And it kind of makes sense because remember that we hadn't reabsorbed much chloride up to this point, and so the chloride levels may be high, and this could be a passive process. Okay? What this does is, as this negative ion moves from here to here, it tends to generate a positive potential over here. Not a big one, but a small one. And so I think you all know by now you can't just move a negative ion from one place to another. It tends to drag with it positive ions. And so another claudin, claudin 2, will actually move a whole bunch of other ions through to follow the chloride. Okay? And again, that'll be a passive process. Yes, ma'am?
Does chloride and a formate antiporter need energy to transport?
Okay, so the question is, does the chloride formate transporter need energy? No, because remember there's a lot of chloride here and it's basically going down its concentration gradient into the cell. Okay, low chloride in the cell. So the chloride is actually driving the formate out, and then the formate combines with the hydrogen ions and comes back again. Okay? Thank you. Good questions. Good questions. Is there anything else to cover here? No, I think that's good. Make sense? And again, water follows because it's still a permeable epithelium. Okay. So let's get to the loop of Henle. We've covered here. We've covered here. Not much goes on here. The descending loop of Henle does not have a lot of transport mechanisms. It is permeable to water, as you might have guessed by the fact that a lot of fluids reabsorbed. But I'll just leave it with this statement that basically water's the only thing that tends to move through the descending loop of Henle. Okay? And how that works we'll go through a lot later. But now let's look at the ascending loop of Henle. Did I get it right this time? Good. There is a co-transporter basically does that. Okay? So, on the luminal membrane, you've got this, the transport is actually electroneutral. Costanzo calls this an electrogenic process, but this is electroneutral. And we'll go through in just a little while how it generates an electrogenic effect. Okay, so electroneutral, everything's taking a ride on the sodium. Okay? Does that look unappealing in any way at all? Do you see any issues with this? I don't know who invented this system, but it looks like it has a potential for a problem. Say what? Thank you. I think you said the same thing. You're not hungry though, are you? Did you go upstairs and get the snacks upstairs? Okay. I do not know why, with all those snacks you have upstairs, I don't know why you don't all put on weight. It's the stress, right? It's burning metabolism. Yeah, okay. All right. So, yeah. My gosh, you can't load a cell with that much potassium. It's already got a lot of potassium in there. It's got to leak out. Okay. And indeed, and remember, cells, a lot of cells have some permeability to potassium, and this is no exception. So some passively moves out this way, and some passively moves out this way. Probably more moves out this way because this has a positive potential on this side. And so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that more potassium goes this way than this way. Okay. So that generates a potassium potential. We have more claudins in the, we have more claudins in the loop of Henle. And this one's claudin 16 mostly. Because this is positive, claudin 16 will move cations, and so cations move through here. And also some sodium and potassium too. But most textbooks are going to focus on these, okay? So that's what's going on in the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle actually is responsible for reabsorbing quite a lot of magnesium and quite a lot of calcium. And we will go through that more later. So one last, couple of things. Water's reabsorbed here, right? Water's not reabsorbed here, 20 to 20. So what's going on here is that this ascending loop is pumping a lot of sodium and other things, but water's not following it, okay? Interesting though, because these are in close proximity, as the sodium is pumped out of there, the water actually flows to meet it. And again, we're going to go through this in a lot more detail later. So the descending limb reabsorbs water, this reabsorbs sodium and other things, and the two work together osmotically. Okay. Just for your information, I know that this may come up on the boards. This is where loop diuretics work. They tend to compete with the chloride site, so they inhibit this furosemide, bumetanide, ethacrynic acid. They inhibit this. Also, there is a syndrome called Barter's syndrome, where this process is deficient, and that's something that can come up on step exams. And you guys are still going to get a number out of step exams, aren't you? Well, wait a minute. January? Yeah, you guys are still going to get a number. Are you ticked off about that? Pleased about that? I think in some ways it's probably a good thing for you. Okay. So any questions on the loop? No. No. Okay. All right. Let's go to the distal tubule. The early part of the distal tubule So I like all these mechanisms, but I told you I was crazy. It's just a lot of detail for you guys, or do you think it's exciting? Okay. One of you thinks it's exciting, and I'm so excited about that I would give you some of these, but you probably don't want anybody to know that you got excited about it, do you? So, see me afterwards. So there are at least two crazy people here, me and one other. Oh, okay, where are we? Oh, early distal tubule, right? I get that right? Yeah. So this is fairly simple. This is straightforward. We like this. Okay. How much easier can it get? Okay. We'll go through some of the implications of this again later, but a very simple sodium chloride co-transporter. And you will often see this abbreviated as sodium chloride co-transport, NCC. And normally I talk about some other things, but I think I'm just going to leave that there for right now. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Couple of things. This is where thiazides act. So thiazides inhibit here. And also there is a disease called Gittelman's, where there is a deficiency in this NCC. And so Gittelman's behaves much like a thiazide diuretic. Okay? And the only reason I mention that is that by the time you get to the step exams, you'll probably be asked to understand what's going on in Barter's and Gittelman's syndrome. Okay? So it's just a heads up. I don't want to go into any more detail than that right now. Okay, last page before we take a break. So now we're in the late part of the nephron, in the collecting duct. And there are a couple of types of cells that we're interested in here. One is the intercalated cell. And this is the alpha intercalated cell. There's a beta, and we'll talk about that much later. And it's interesting because it has 3 primary active transporters that are prominent here. So, all right, here's a trick question. Is this a secondary active transport? No, it isn't, is it? So again, we are moving potassium into the cell by 2 different mechanisms. But what I would like to convince you of is that, first of all, getting rid of acid is hard work. And we could do a lot in the proximal tubule, but this is kind of the final squeeze. We actually have some primary active proton transporters to really shove the last amount of acid out. And you can actually get the urine pH down to about 4, close to 4. So that's very acidic. Not quite enough to burn a hole in the tubule, but it's very acidic. So it's geared up for getting rid of acid by 2 primary active transporters. So we've got 3 primary active transporters here. Okay. You know, when this was designed and put together, you know there had to be a reason for doing 2 of these. And because you're all fairly bright people, you've probably figured out it may have something to do with potassium handling. Yeah? So later on, we're going to talk about potassium handling. A lot depends on how much potassium we eat. If we eat a lot of potassium, we might need to get rid of a lot of potassium. But if we're potassium deficient, we might need to reabsorb some here. And so we have a mechanism set up that if we need to reabsorb potassium, we could turn this on in preference to that one. If we don't want to reabsorb potassium, we turn this one on in preference to this one. Okay? So it's kind of neat. Let's now put the principal cell in. And we have 2 mechanisms here. One is passive sodium transport, and this is through a channel, and the channel is called ENaC, epithelial sodium channel. And we have another channel. We call that ROM-K. There are actually other channels too for potassium, but I'll just focus on ROM-K. And just to be complete, renal outer medullary potassium channel. It's kind of an old-fashioned name. It occurs in places other than the outer medulla. But so this setup, you can see that clearly it's involved in more sodium reabsorption, and this is regulated. If you need to regulate sodium, this is a primary side of sodium regulation. So in other words, if you want to reabsorb more sodium, you turn this guy on. It's also a site for potassium secretion. Remember I said to you earlier that potassium we have a lot of, and we probably need to have mechanisms to secrete. Wow. I wonder if I did that. I did. Oh. Where was I? Right, yeah. So, so we also have the ability to secrete potassium here. So depending on what we want to do with potassium overall, we can either turn on this to reabsorb or turn on this to secrete. And so it's just a kind of a push me, pull you between those two. So that's the principal cell. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to add. Oh, yeah, of course I do. So diuretics that work here, like amiloride and aldosterone antagonists, are referred to as potassium-sparing diuretics. So how does that work? If you inhibit this cell with amiloride or an aldosterone antagonist, what is the overall effect? It's going to limit the loss of potassium, isn't it? If you poison this cell, it turns this off and it turns this off. And so it limits the amount of potassium secretion in these cells, hence potassium sparing. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that you use a potassium sparing diuretic and you don't lose potassium. It just kind of limits it. You know, any kind of diuretic is likely to lose potassium, but this loses less potassium than you might otherwise if you inhibit sodium reabsorption elsewhere. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
For the distal, for this collecting tubule, there is a lot of hydrogen secreted into the lumen. So why the luminal charge is negative at this point?
Okay, so the question is, if you are moving so much hydrogen ion into the tubule, why don't you have a positive lumen potential? And because although we're actually, it's a good question, because although we are moving frantically trying to move hydrogen, in bulk amounts it's not a great deal. Okay, so how shall I put this? Even though this is the powerful proton mover, still most of the hydrogen probably, and I'm just going to make up a figure because I don't know the exact figure, probably 95% of the hydrogen ion is reabsorbed earlier on in the proximal tubule. Okay, so it's not actually in bulk terms a lot, but you also have other ions moving too. Remember, these two cells are in close proximity to each other, and so the potential for one is the potential for the other. Okay, and so, you know, we've got a lot of these cells that are moving, and they're generating a positive potential in that direction. Positive here, negative here. Okay? Good question, thank you. All right, let's take a break and come back just before 10 past.